A fifth-grade teacher opens a child's lunchbox and finds no food, just a single ketchup packet and a crumpled note that reads, "I'm hungry. Don't tell nobody." But what shook him more was the next line. Mama said don't trust no white people. That moment unraveled a school-wide conspiracy of racial profiling, secret suspensions, and one boy already sentenced before he could speak. But when the teacher tried to help, they accused him of being the danger. And the most shocking part, this story is real, and it's just beginning. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun filtered softly through the smudged windows of Maplewood Elementary, as Mr. Calvin Brooks stepped into room 12 for the first time. Freshly printed name tags lined the desks, bright paper borders trimmed the bulletin boards. The stale scent of industrial cleaner hung in the air. All textbook signs of the first day of school in a public district just barely holding itself together. Calvin adjusted the cuffs of his neatly ironed dress shirt, a habitual gesture of calm in the face of nerves. This wasn't just another teaching assignment. It was a reset. A personal promise. After 7 years teaching in Atlanta's metro system, he had accepted a lateral transfer to this rural Mississippi district, with hopes of reconnecting with why he became an educator in the first place. To reach the kids no one seemed to notice. He had done his research. The town of Eldridge Hollow was small, conservative, and historically segregated. Although legally integrated decades ago, the school reflected the town's unspoken lines. White children were in gifted programs, leading morning announcements and science fairs. Black children, fewer in number, from the west side of town, rarely appeared in brochures or photos on the school's website. Calvin noticed this in passing. What he didn't expect was to come face to face with that quiet imbalance before first period even began. The students filed in, loud and bright, with chatter and fresh backpacks. Calvin greeted each one with a warm, practiced smile, noting their names, how they looked at him. Some curious, others unsure. Then Jamari Gaines walked in. He was the only child who didn't speak. Jamari's presence was small, not just in stature, though he was notably shorter than his peers, but in spirit, as if he were trying to take up as little space as possible. His backpack sagged with broken zippers, and his polo shirt had a faint stain near the collar, the kind that wouldn't come out in cold water. His shoes, Calvin noticed instantly, were at least a size too small, the soles separating at the toes. Jamari made his way to the desk farthest from the window, slid into the seat without a word, and placed a square metal Avengers lunchbox on the table. He didn't open it, just rested his hand on top, as if guarding it. Throughout the morning, Calvin observed. Jamari didn't raise his hand, didn't speak unless directly spoken to, and even then, responded with a simple nod or shake of the head. When the class giggled during a story or whispered during math, Jamari remained silent, his eyes downcast. But it was during lunch that the first fracture appeared. The bell rang, and the students scrambled for the cafeteria line, eager for Friday pizza. A few pulled out neatly packed lunches from home. Calvin, tasked with supervising lunch duty for the week, stayed behind to guide the few who needed reminders. That's when he saw Jamari again, sitting quietly at his desk, opening his lunchbox. There was no food inside. Instead, there was a folded napkin, a plastic spoon, and a single ketchup packet. Calvin paused, blinking. Maybe Jamari was waiting for something else. But no, the boy looked inside the empty box, closed it slowly, and placed it on his lap like it was perfectly normal. Calvin walked over. "Hey Jamari, you headed to lunch?" Jamari flinched slightly, then shook his head. "You bring something from home?" The boy hesitated, then gave the slightest nod. Calvin glanced at the lunchbox again but didn't press. "All right," he said gently, masking his concern. "Let me know if you need anything, okay?" No response. That night, Calvin couldn't shake the image. An empty lunchbox, not even crumbs. A ketchup packet. He opened the faculty handbook, flipping to the lunch policy. The school offered reduced lunch programs. Jamari should have been eligible. Had someone failed to enroll him, or was there a deeper issue? The next day, Calvin approached the school counselor, Miss Devlin. Her office was decorated in pastel tones and motivational posters. "I wanted to ask about one of my students, Jamari Gaines," he said. "Is he enrolled in the meal program?" She leaned back. "Jamari? Yeah, he is, but he rarely uses it." "Why not?" She sighed, flipping through a binder. "That family's difficult. The moms had complaints, CPS involvement. And Jamari, he's been flagged for behavioral issues. 3 suspensions last year. Calvin blinked. Suspensions? He barely speaks. Exactly. Non-compliance. Defiance. He's one of those kids that shuts down instead of acting out. Makes him hard to reach. Has anyone tried? She paused. We have to focus our resources where they'll go the furthest. Shamari's not exactly responsive. The words stuck like burrs. Calvin left the office more disturbed than informed. A child labeled a problem simply for existing quietly, while clearly starving. Back in the classroom, Calvin paid closer attention. Jamari sat through the lessons like a ghost, never drawing attention, never participating. His answers, when given, were always correct, but hesitant, as if afraid to be right. At lunch again, Calvin watched from a distance. Jamari opened the same Avengers lunchbox. This time Calvin saw something else. A slip of paper inside. Jamari quickly pulled it out, glanced around, and stuffed it into his pocket before closing the box again. Calvin narrowed his eyes, curiosity overtaking protocol. He approached with measured calm. You good today, Jamari? The boy nodded. What's for lunch? Jamari's eyes shifted. Then he stood abruptly. Not hungry, he murmured, almost inaudible, and left for the hallway. After class, when the students had gone, Calvin walked to Jamari's desk and opened the lunchbox. The inside was clean, empty except for the folded napkin, but underneath, wedged in the metal crease, was something that hadn't been there before. A second note. It was scribbled on lined notebook paper, the kind torn hastily from the back of a workbook. Slanted, uneven handwriting. It read, I'm hungry. Don't tell nobody. Mama said don't trust no white people. Calvin froze. The classroom suddenly felt colder, the buzz of the overhead lights harsher. He read the words again, then folded the note and slid it into his pocket with trembling fingers. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't disinterest. This was fear. Conditioned, generational fear. That night, Calvin sat at his kitchen table, long after the sun dipped behind the woods outside his small rental house. The note lay unfolded in front of him. So many layers in a single sentence. Hunger, secrecy, distrust. Not of institutions, but of people who looked like him. He thought about his own journey. A black man who had fought to rise through a system never designed to hold him, only to find himself a part of it, and now unsure if he was helping or just another cog. He remembered his own 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Reinhardt, who once told him he was too intense for group projects. She'd written in his file that he had leadership issues. That label followed him into middle school. It took his mother 4 meetings and 1 lawyer to get it removed. Jamari wouldn't have a lawyer. Maybe not even a meeting. The next morning, Calvin made a decision. Before the lunch bell rang, before the noise and chaos returned, he walked to Jamari's desk, lifted the lunchbox again, and opened it. Inside was another note. But this time, it wasn't a message. It was a drawing. A jail cell. A stick figure behind bars. Calvin stared, breath caught in his throat. Below the image were 5 words. That's where they'll put me. Calvin decides to look inside Jamari's lunchbox again. The next day, and what he finds changes everything. Mr. Calvin Brooks stood frozen beside Jamari's desk, the small Avengers lunchbox open in front of him, the crumpled note clutched lightly between his fingers. The words were simple, almost childlike in tone, but they pierced with brutal honesty. I'm hungry. Don't tell nobody. Mama said don't trust no white people. A wave of emotions surged in Calvin's chest. Heartbreak, confusion, anger. It was a cry for help, and a warning. One born not out of defiance, but from a fear carefully taught, likely over years. He folded the notes slowly, his mind racing. This wasn't just a case of a forgotten sandwich or a tough financial week. This was systemic, woven deep. He knew he couldn't confront Jamari directly. Any wrong move might close the fragile thread of trust the boy had begun to show. So he began quietly, cautiously, trying to understand the full picture, a picture that many had seen before and turned away from. In the teacher's lounge that afternoon, Calvin approached Mr. Dunning, a veteran math teacher sipping lukewarm coffee from a stained mug. Hey, Calvin began casually. You've been here a while. Do you know much about Jamari Gaines? One of my kids. Dunning gave a look that mixed mild amusement and dismissiveness. Gaines? Oh, that family. He shook his head. You'll waste your time there. His mom's always angry about something. pulled the race card once during a parent-teacher conference, swore we were targeting her son. Calvin's jaw tightened. Were you? Dunning gave a chuckle that wasn't quite friendly. Look, some kids are just difficult. If you try to save every one of them, you'll burn out by winter break. The conversation ended there, but Calvin's curiosity, no, his responsibility, only deepened. Later that week, Calvin quietly requested access to Jamari's emergency contact form, under the guise of updating records. The address listed was an apartment complex he had driven past, run down, paint peeling from balconies with a patrol car often parked nearby. He made a note to visit, not to intervene yet, just observe. But before he could, the next revelation came from an unexpected place, the cafeteria. Calvin approached Mrs. Claire Johnson, the lunchroom manager, as she was restocking juice cartons. Can I ask you something about Jamari Gaines? She paused, hesitant, then shrugged. Sure. Has he been skipping meals? I've noticed he hasn't been eating lately. Claire looked away, her voice quieter. He was. He used to come in, but his account ran negative. We have a no-debt policy. But don't you serve food anyway? She nodded reluctantly. Technically, yes. We're supposed to give an alternative meal if the account's overdrawn. A cheese sandwich and a milk. But, I mean, sometimes kids forget to bring their lunch or lie about it, so we follow the rules. Calvin studied her. Do you apply that policy to everyone? She hesitated too long. I've seen kids grab hot meals with overdue balances, Calvin said quietly. Usually not kids who look like Jamari. Claire flushed. Look, I don't make the rules. No, Calvin replied, calm but firm. You just choose who they apply to. That night, Calvin couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling in his small apartment, thinking about the note, the cold sandwich policy, the empty eyes of a boy too proud to eat. He decided to act. The next morning, before the bell rang, Calvin slipped into the classroom early. Inside his briefcase was a carefully packed lunch, turkey sandwich, apple slices, and a bottled water, wrapped in a brown paper bag with no name. He placed it gently inside Jamari's desk, right beneath his notebook. No note, no announcement. Just a quiet offering. At lunch he watched from a corner of the room, as Jamari sat at his desk again. Lunchbox unopened. The boy glanced around, then reached under the desk. His fingers found the bag. He pulled it out slowly. For a moment, Calvin thought it had worked. But then Jamari looked across the room, caught Calvin's gaze, and immediately shoved the bag into his backpack. He didn't eat. After class, the brown bag was gone, but the lunchbox remained untouched. Calvin found himself walking the halls later, restless. That's when he saw Jamari in the library, alone, sitting between shelves with a book open on his lap, but his eyes unfocused. Calvin approached gently. Hey buddy, you doing okay? Jamari nodded, quick and mechanical. You didn't eat lunch today. Another nod. I left something for you just in case. Jamari looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. Why? Calvin knelt to meet his eyes. Because I care. Jamari blinked rapidly. His lips parted, then closed again. A moment passed. Then he whispered. Mama said not to trust nobody. Especially not. He stopped. Calvin filled in the blank silently. White people. I understand, Calvin said, not defensively. Sometimes people who look like me don't always do the right thing, but I'm not here to hurt you. Just want to help. Jamari didn't respond, but he didn't run either. That was something. What Calvin didn't see, what no one at the school saw, were the battles being waged behind Jamari's silence. Kenisha Gaines, 29, single mother, was working double shifts at a discount furniture store, across town. Every morning she rode a borrowed bike with faulty brakes to the bus stop, then caught 2 transfers to make it to the store by 8 a.m. She was always 5 minutes late. Her supervisor, a heavy-set man named Ron with a thin mustache and a shorter fuse, had written her up 3 times that month. You people are always full of excuses, he'd muttered last Tuesday, tossing her right up on the counter. She'd swallowed her anger. Again. At home, her apartment was cold. The power had been off for 4 hours. An eviction notice, 3 days old, curled slightly at the corners on the countertop. She hadn't told Jamari yet. He'd cry, and she couldn't handle that on top of everything else. The rent assistance application was denied. The woman at the housing office had smiled too wide, used a voice that was too sweet when she said, Unfortunately, you don't meet the current priority bracket. Kanisha knew what that meant. She didn't have a drug conviction, didn't have 3 kids by 3 different men. She wasn't the right kind of struggling, so she got nothing. She told Jamari to keep his head down at school, to say yes ma'am, no sir and never ever talk back. They don't see you like they see them, she'd said while tying his shoelace one morning. They already decided who you are. Jamari had nodded. The food stamps had run short that week. She packed his lunchbox with a napkin, a spoon, and nothing else better to look like he forgot than to admit the truth. She warned him not to say a word. But when Jamari looked at Mr. Brooks, kind eyes, warm voice, a crack had formed, and that scared Kanisha more than anything. That week, Calvin tried again. Another lunch, this time with a small post-it, thought you might like this. He left it in the same spot. But again, Jamari refused to eat. He returned the bag at the end of the day, untouched. Calvin was left staring at the brown paper bag on his desk, a quiet rejection that hurt more than he expected. This wasn't about food anymore, it was about dignity. He sat heavily in his chair and closed his eyes. Jamari didn't need charity. He needed humanity. Respect, not pity.
That night, Calvin began drafting a new plan. Something beyond secret lunches or whispered kindness. Something structural. He wasn't sure what it looked like yet. But he was sure of one thing. He would not walk away.
The next morning, as the class settled into their reading time, Calvin asked a question aloud, meant for everyone. What does it mean to have a voice? A few students chimed in with playful answers, but when Calvin glanced at Jamari, the boy looked back, silent but something flickering in his eyes. Later that day, Calvin went through old attendance reports, writing samples, and class participation logs. That's when he discovered something chilling. Jamari Gaines hadn't spoken a full sentence in class in over 6 weeks, and Calvin was about to find out exactly why. The classroom walls whispered more than the lessons on the whiteboard. There were stories buried beneath every student's silence, but Jamari's silence, Calvin now realized, wasn't absence, it was armor. That morning, Calvin sat at his desk long after the final bell, flipping through Jamari's participation logs and behavior reports from previous school years. He scanned each page carefully, each paragraph of bureaucratic language crafted to sound objective, yet unmistakably coded. Exhibits signs of aggression when challenged, demonstrates resistance to instruction, likely to escalate when corrected. Then Calvin found one that stopped him cold. Displays early indicators of oppositional defiant disorder. He checked the date. It had been written when Jamari was just 7 years old, by a teacher Calvin had never met, in a classroom that no longer existed after the school merged buildings. He dug deeper, scanning the old files with a mounting weight in his chest. The pattern wasn't random. Jamari had been suspended twice in 2nd grade, once for non-compliance after refusing to stop asking questions during a math test, and once for disruptive behavior after crying when he couldn't finish a timed reading assignment. Calvin clenched his jaw. He knew what those labels meant. He had seen them before, quiet flags that followed black boys like scars in ink, subtle but damning. When a white child asked too many questions, they were inquisitive. When Jamari asked, it became challenging the teacher. When a white student cried, they were overwhelmed. When Jamari did it, he was emotionally unstable. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and let the frustration simmer. How many other Jamari Gaines were walking these halls? How many had already vanished into the cracks between phrases like persistent non-compliance and disruption of learning environment? Outside the classroom, the hallway buzzed with movement. Calvin stood slowly and walked toward the staff lounge, where the weekly instructional leadership meeting was already in motion. The room was half filled when he entered. At the head of the long table sat Principal Vera Langford, a sharp-jawed woman in her late 40s, with silver-streaked hair and a penchant for control. To her right was Miss Rivers, the vice principal, and around the table were various grade-level leads and specialists. Calvin took his seat quietly, as the meeting began with updates about standardized test benchmarks, new safety drills, and parent engagement plans, none of which mentioned the growing, festering inequalities he now saw with clarity. Then, as if on cue, Ms. Langford's tone shifted. Now, she said, flipping a folder open. Behavioral watch list, Jamari Gaines, 5th grade, room 12. Mr. Brooks, he's one of yours. Calvin sat up straighter. Langford didn't wait for a reply. We've had multiple reports of him refusing to participate. Nonverbal, won't eat. Last year was a nightmare, Constant classroom disruptions, tantrums, defiant. That's not what I've seen, Calvin said, careful but firm. Langford raised a brow. He hasn't spoken a full sentence in weeks. That's a red flag. He's not disruptive, Calvin replied. He's cautious, watchful. But when he engages, he's sharp. He's respectful. Quiet, yes, but not defiant. Mr. Evers sighed. The file doesn't lie. No, Calvin said, his voice a notch louder. But who wrote the file? The room paused. Miss Langford stared at him like he'd overstepped a boundary not written in any manual. Mr. Brooks, she said coolly, we understand you're still new here, but we've worked with this family for years. The mother has a long history of conflict with staff. Jamari's going to need serious intervention. He's likely headed for alternative schooling next semester. Calvin blinked. Alternative schooling. He's 10. We're trying to be proactive. No, Calvin said, voice steady but firm. You're trying to disappear him before he makes too much noise. Langford's jaw twitched. The tension in the room thickened. Excuse me, she said. You've labeled a child emotionally unstable because he cried during a timed test. You've punished him for asking questions. You've ignored his hunger, his silence, his trauma, and now you're pushing him out. That is not how we handle student support, Langford snapped. And I don't appreciate the implication that… I'm not implying, Calvin interrupted, his voice sharp now. I'm reading the evidence you wrote. You treat the white boys like projects. You treat Jamari like a threat. Silent. Evers leaned forward. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious failure, Calvin countered. The room was still. A few teachers avoided eye contact. Others looked at Calvin with the kind of expression people use when they don't want to be associated with a fire too close to the gas line. Langford closed the folder. Mr. Brooks, I think you need to take a step back and reflect on how you're approaching this conversation. We all want what's best for our students, but tone matters. Perception matters. No, Calvin said, standing slowly. What matters is whether Jamari ever gets to speak again, without being punished for it. He left the room without another word. Back in his classroom, Calvin stared at the dusty windows. The sun filtered in just like the first day, soft, deceptively warm. But now he saw everything differently. He wasn't just fighting for Jamari's voice. He was fighting for a system that had already decided that voice didn't matter. That afternoon, while the students worked quietly in small reading groups, Calvin sat beside Jamari's desk. Can I ask you something? He said gently. Jamari looked up. Do you remember a test last year where you had to read something fast? The boy blinked, then slowly nodded. Did you cry? Jamari's lips pressed together. A small nod. Did someone yell at you after? Another nod. This time his eyes filled with water. He quickly looked away. Calvin didn't push further. He placed a quiet hand on the desk and said, You don't have to say anything if you don't want. But I hear you, even when it's quiet. Jamari stared at the tabletop, fists clenched in his lap. Later that night, Calvin called a contact he hadn't spoken to in months, Dr. Alana Fields, a child psychologist who used to do assessments for the Atlanta school system. They spoke for 30 minutes. Calvin explained Jamari's behavior. The file, the silence. It sounds like trauma suppression, she said. Not a disorder, a coping mechanism. He's learned that talking gets him punished. So he stopped. Did anything help? Calvin asked. Consistency, empathy, and the freedom to speak on his own terms. Before they hung up, Alana added something else. Just be ready. When the voice comes back, it might tell you more than you were ready to hear. The next day, Calvin arrived early and prepared a new assignment for his students. A short story. Write about a time you were scared, he wrote on the board. No rules, no grades, just honesty. Jamari didn't move for the first 10 minutes. Then, slowly, he picked up his pencil. Calvin walked past him quietly, pretending not to look, but as he glanced down, he saw the first words forming on the page. I was 5. It was loud. They yelled at Mama. She cried. I didn't talk that day. Calvin's heart pounded. Jamari kept writing. By the time class ended, his paper was nearly full. No one else's was. Calvin read it that night alone in his apartment. It was rough, fragmented, but it told a story of a police raid, of crying behind a couch, of a mother begging, of no charges filed, just broken furniture, and a memory seared into a child's sense of safety. The next morning, Calvin brought the story to the principal's office. Langford refused to look at it. I don't have time for emotionally driven complaints, Mr. Brooks. It's not a complaint, Calvin said, placing the paper on her desk. It's a voice. One you tried to silence. Langford's eyes narrowed. You're dangerously close to insubordination. No, Calvin replied. I'm dangerously close to telling the truth. He turned to leave. Langford's voice followed him. You need to decide, Mr. Brooks, if this crusade of yours is worth your career. He didn't respond. But deep down he knew. Because in a file cabinet down the hall, in a folder marked disciplinary watch, a black child's name had already been stamped with his fate. Likely to escalate. And now Calvin's refusal to be silent was about to escalate too, because someone else had been watching. The Monday after the staff meeting felt different the moment Calvin stepped onto campus. There were no greetings in the hallway. No smiles from colleagues. No casual nods or updates on lesson plans. The warmth that had once felt tentative now turned to ice. As he walked into the faculty lounge to pour his coffee, two teachers stood by the vending machine. They stopped talking as he approached. One of them, Elkins, the second-grade reading specialist, pretended to check her phone, while the other offered a half-smile that evaporated the moment he turned away. Calvin had seen this kind of silence before, not in volume but in meaning. It wasn't confusion, it was condemnation. The source became clear by midday. He was called into Vice Principal Evers' office between classes. The blinds were drawn. The chair across from the desk felt colder than usual. Evers didn't offer coffee, didn't smile. Mr. Brooks, he began, tone clipped. We've had some concerns raised about your focus in the classroom. Calvin folded his hands. Concerns from whom?
Evers didn't answer directly.
Some teachers are worried that your approach to certain students, specifically Jamari Gaines, might be disruptive to school culture. Calvin raised an eyebrow. Disruptive how? There's been talk, Evers continued, that you're bringing personal bias into the curriculum, pushing race narratives into unrelated lessons, making certain students uncomfortable. I'm teaching children who live real lives, Calvin said calmly. I'm not pushing a narrative, I'm refusing to ignore the truth. Evers tapped his pen against the desk. Look, we appreciate passion, but we also have boundaries, and boundaries matter, especially when they make others feel like they're being accused. Calvin's voice tightened. Are we more worried about the feelings of staff or the silence of a hungry child? Evers leaned back. You might want to take a step back, Mr. Brooks. Focus on the curriculum. Let support services handle behavioral issues. That was the warning, veiled, but sharp. Don't overstep. Don't disrupt the order. Don't make anyone uncomfortable. By Wednesday, it wasn't just cold glances or short answers. Calvin walked into the lounge at lunchtime, and the room fell instantly quiet. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Teachers stared into their microwaves, their phones, anywhere but at him. Even the normally friendly janitor, Mr. Lowell, gave a nod that felt more like a caution than a greeting. It got worse. That afternoon, as he walked to the parking lot under gray Mississippi skies, he saw it. A long, jagged scratch snaking across the driver's side of his car, deep enough to expose bare metal. His chest tightened. He scanned the lot. Empty. No witnesses. He checked the school's security camera on the corner of the building. The red light blinked. But when he reported it to the front office, the secretary's voice was syrupy with indifference. Oh, that camera doesn't record. Budget issue. Just for show. Calvin didn't press. He knew this wasn't random. This wasn't petty. This was a message. That night, he opened a fresh notebook and began documenting everything. Times, names, phrases. He scanned copies of Jamari's reports, highlighted discriminatory language, wrote detailed accounts of every hostile interaction with staff. Because he had learned one thing in his years of teaching. Truth didn't protect you. Documentation did. But something inside him needed more. He was tired of watching a child shrink in front of him, while adults argued about policies and optics. He needed to see where Jamari came from, who was protecting him, if anyone. So on Thursday afternoon, Calvin drove across town. Eldridge Hollow split itself neatly down the middle east of the train tracks were lawns, SUV driveways, porch swings. West of the tracks, concrete, projects, patrols. He parked 3 blocks from the address listed in Jamari's school file. The closer he got, the clearer the difference became. No streetlights, cracked sidewalks, the hum of broken air conditioners wheezing through dented windows. And then, something even more jarring. A black and white Eldridge police cruiser parked diagonally across from the entrance of Building 6. The officer inside sat stone-faced, sunglasses on. Despite the fading sun, a radar gun resting across his lap, aimed at nothing, just watching. Across the cracked courtyard, a group of young boys rode bicycles, zigzagging around potholes. Every time they neared the street, they slowed, glanced at the cruiser, and swerved back like moths avoiding a flame. Calvin's stomach twisted. He stood outside the gate for a moment, unsure of his next move. That's when a voice called from above. "You lost?" He looked up. A woman leaned over a second-floor railing, arms crossed, hair wrapped in a scarf. Her voice was sharp, not angry, but tired. "I'm looking for Kenesha Gaines," Calvin called back. "I'm her son's teacher." The woman studied him a beat too long, then pointed toward a door 2 units down. "Don't stay long," she muttered. "Cops been circling like buzzards today." Calvin nodded and approached the door. It opened before he knocked. Kenesha Gaines stood in the doorway, barefoot, a dish towel slung over one shoulder. Her eyes wide, guarded and exhausted, scanned him from head to toe. "You Mr. Brooks?" "Yes, ma'am. I teach Jamari."
I figured.
She glanced past him, then stepped aside. "Come in. But don't sit down unless you trust public housing couches." Inside, the apartment was clean but bare. A small couch, a folding table, a pile of laundry near the wall. On the fridge, taped with scotch, was one of Jamari's drawings, a stick figure standing under a tree, arms raised. Calvin stood in the middle of the living room. "I didn't mean to intrude. Kenesha cut him off. "You're here because my boy wrote something, huh?" Calvin nodded. "He's been through a lot." She exhaled hard, ran a hand down her face. "You don't even know the half of it." "I'd like to." "No, you wouldn't. I care." Kenesha looked at him, long and unblinking. Then her voice dropped. "Look, I know who you are. Teachers like you come around every couple years. All good intentions, all fire and speeches about saving kids." She stepped closer. "But here's what happens. Y'all push too hard. The school pushes back harder, and then it's my son who pays the price." "That's not what It's what happens," she interrupted. "You don't think I've had teachers before say they cared, and then call CPS because Jamari had a bruise on his arm from falling downstairs?" Calvin hesitated. "That's not me. I know. That's what scares me. You seem real." She looked away. "And real gets dangerous." She turned and opened a cupboard. Inside were 2 cans of beans, a half-empty box of rice, and a stack of plastic forks. "We ain't starving, but we ain't winning either," she said. "I work double shifts. Still can't keep the lights on full-time." Calvin's voice softened. "Kenesha, I don't want to expose your family. I just want to support Jamari. He's not okay." Kenesha's voice cracked, just slightly. "Of course he's not. He sees everything. He hears me cry when I think he's asleep. He watches how people look at us in stores. You think he doesn't know what's coming?" She stepped closer. "And now you a black man in a white school. You think they're gonna let you protect him without a price?" Calvin didn't answer. Kenesha crossed her arms. "You want to help? Then stop asking questions. Stop putting a target on him. Just let him be quiet. At least quiet keeps him safe." He met her eyes. "Silence is not safety. It's the only kind we can afford," she whispered. Then her voice hardened again. "You're a good man, Mr. Brooks. I see that, but I need you to do something for me. Anything. Leave my son alone." And as the door closed behind him, Calvin realized, saving Jamari might mean losing everything else. The door to Kenesha's apartment shut with a thud that felt heavier than the frame could explain. Calvin stood in the dimly lit hallway for a moment, stunned, not just by her words, but by the weight they carried. "Leave my son alone." He had walked in expecting suspicion, even resentment. But what he'd just witnessed wasn't hostility. It was fear. Deep, bone-etched fear. Not of him, but of what people like him, in his position, could trigger. He walked back to his car slowly, each step echoing on the cracked concrete. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Her words looped in his head. "Y'all don't come to help. You come to take." And the thing that scared him most, she wasn't wrong. The next morning, Calvin entered room 12 with a heavier heart. Jamari sat at his desk, as usual, eyes low, hands folded neatly over the same worn Avengers lunchbox. For the first time, Calvin hesitated. Every instinct screamed to check the box again, but Kanisha's voice haunted him. Just let him be quiet. So he didn't approach. Not directly. Instead, he watched as Jamari opened the box, not expecting much inside. But this time, there was a sandwich, white bread, flattened at the edges, and a note taped inside the lid. Jamari read it, then folded it shut quickly. Whatever was written, it wasn't for Calvin. Not today. After class, Calvin sat in his chair staring out the window at the distant tree line. A knock on the door startled him. It was Miss Paula Vasquez, the school social worker, clipboard in hand. "We're following up on an anonymous concern," she said without a smile. Calvin frowned. What kind of concern? Something about a teacher crossing boundaries with a student. She didn't say the name. She didn't have to. Calvin's jaw tightened. "You know this is retaliation, right?" Vasquez didn't blink. "I'm just doing my job." The air in the room thickened. Calvin wanted to scream. He wanted to shout that the real crime wasn't proximity. It was apathy. That letting a boy starve silently was far more invasive than caring too loudly. But he didn't say any of that. He just nodded and let her walk out, already knowing where this was headed. After school, he drove back to Kanisha's place, not as a teacher, as a human being. When she opened the door this time, her expression wasn't angry. It was empty. "What now?" she asked. Not harshly. Just exhausted. "I'm not here to push," Calvin said softly. I need you to understand what I saw in your son today." He's trying to speak, but he's scared. Kanisha leaned against the doorframe. Her eyes were rimmed red. Her voice cracked. "You think I don't know that? I think you're doing everything you can," he said. "But I also think you're drowning alone." Her silence was answer enough. After a moment, she stepped aside and let him in. This time, the air felt different. No warnings. Just weight. The kind that builds over years, until it becomes the atmosphere itself. She walked to the kitchen counter and pulled a stack of folded papers from under a chipped cookie jar. One by one, she laid them out like evidence in a trial. "Eviction notice," she said, tapping the top paper. 15 days. She unfolded another.
"Food stamps cut,"
said I missed. A form. I didn't. Another. "Job warning. If I'm late again, I'm gone. My shift starts before the buses run. You tell me how I'm supposed to get Jamari to school." Calvin looked at each paper, each word, each date. "The system," she whispered, "don't want black mothers to survive, just wants us to shut up and lose." She paused. "They called CPS on me 2 years ago. Teacher said Jamari had a bruise. You know what it was? He fell. In our kitchen. On a plastic chair. You think they believed that?" Her eyes burned. "They came to take him. For 3 hours, they kept him in a stranger's car. Wouldn't let me ride. Jamari ain't slept right since." Calvin felt like someone had pressed a cold hand against the back of his neck. All the policies, all the neutral protocols, they weren't just flawed. They were weapons. Kanisha sat down on the couch, the same one she had joked about before. "I used to believe teachers helped," she said, softer now. "But y'all work in a machine, a big, smiling machine. And every time it breaks, it's our kids that get chewed up. I'm not part of that machine," Calvin said quietly. "Maybe not yet," she replied. "But it'll chew you too." A long silence followed. Then, a voice from the hallway. "Mama?" Jamari stood there, holding a crumpled piece of paper. His eyes flicked to Calvin, then back to his mother. Kanisha wiped her face quickly. But not fast enough. Jamari stared, then said, "You crying?" It was barely more than a whisper. But it stopped everything. Kanisha tried to laugh, to mask it. "Nah, baby. Just tired." Jamari stepped closer, confused. It was the first time Calvin had seen his face change, really change in front of anyone. The fear cracked, if only slightly. Calvin stood to leave, sensing the moment wasn't his to share. As he reached the door, he turned. "Thank you for letting me in." Kanisha didn't respond, but she didn't stop him either. That night back in his apartment, Calvin couldn't shake the image of Jamari holding that piece of paper. Something in his hand, maybe something he'd written, looked familiar. The next morning, he entered the classroom early. Jamari was already there, quietly unpacking. He didn't speak.
Neither did Calvin.
Until lunch. When the bell rang, Jamari stayed in his seat again, as usual. But today, there was something different in how he opened his lunchbox. He didn't rush. He didn't hide it. He unfolded the paper inside and looked up directly at Calvin, before slowly pushing it toward the edge of the desk. Calvin walked over, heart tight, and gently picked it up. It was a drawing, crude, with pencil smudges and no color, but unmistakable. A stick figure behind bars, vertical lines across a square box, and beneath it, in sharp block letters.
That's where they're gonna put me.
Calvin stared at the page, his hands trembling. Jamari didn't flinch. He just looked at his teacher, straight, calm, resolved. And for the first time, Calvin knew, Jamari didn't just fear punishment. He feared prophecy. Calvin sat at his desk after school, the drawing still in his hand, the one Jamari had slid across the desk like a final confession. That's where they're gonna put me. The lines of the jail cell on the page weren't just graphite. They were prophecy, precise, heavy. He turned the paper over. Nothing on the back, no name, no date, just silence soaked into the paper. That night, Calvin didn't cook, didn't eat. He opened his laptop instead and pulled up the school district's publicly available data reports, attendance, disciplinary actions, standardized testing scores, all laid out in spreadsheets that claimed to be neutral. He filtered by race, gender, age. What emerged made his stomach knot. Black boys, particularly in grades 3 through 6, were being suspended 5 times more than their white peers in the same classrooms. And for what? He opened each case study he could find from past years. The language repeated over and over like some silent choir of bureaucracy. Disruptive behavior. Failure to comply with instruction. Emotional outburst. But when he drilled down, the behaviors were often minor. Eye-rolling, refusing to stand during the pledge, asking too many questions during tests, or in one documented case from the year before, screaming uncontrollably in the hallway during a fire drill. He found the name attached to that file, a black 4th grader named Malik Jensen. He cross-referenced it with a news article buried in a local archive. School officer handcuffs child after safety disruption. Calvin clicked. The report was chilling. Malik had a documented anxiety disorder. He became overstimulated during the drill, screamed, panicked. A teacher couldn't calm him. The school resource officer restrained him in the hallway, placed plastic cuffs on his wrists, and sat him on the floor until he stopped crying. 9 years old. The incident had resulted in Malik's transfer to a behavioral facility. No follow-up. No public outcry. The system had swallowed him. The next morning, Calvin skipped the lounge. He didn't speak to staff. He spent his planning period calling the retired teacher, whose name appeared on some of the older discipline files, Mrs. Etta Price. He remembered her. Older, strict, but respected. She answered after the 3rd ring. "Mr. Brooks," she said. "I was wondering when someone was gonna call." Calvin paused. "You knew?" "I knew." Her voice was clear, low. "They don't teach black boys here. They manage them." Calvin swallowed. "I need to understand. What is this system?" Mrs. Price didn't hesitate. "It's not education," she said. "It's containment. That's the game. Keep them quiet. Keep them moving, and if they don't comply, remove them. Remove them to where? Alternative schools. Juvenile court referrals. Early intervention programs. That's what they call it when they label a 10-year-old violent for yelling in math class. You've seen the cops parked outside Jamari's building." Calvin nodded silently. "They're not there to protect," she said. "They're waiting." He felt something sharp settle in his gut. "Why didn't you fight it?" "I tried," she said. "I filed complaints. Testified. They called me too political. Said I was destabilizing morale." Calvin exhaled, slow and bitter. "I thought I could save him." "You might," she said. "But you'll lose everything else." Calvin hung up and opened a new document on his laptop. This time it wouldn't be a complaint filed quietly, or an anonymous report buried in district folders. This time, it would be public. He wrote with fury, not rage, but purpose. Every sentence traced with precision. The silence around the systematic targeting of black boys in our school district is not a flaw, it is policy by design. The data is clear. The actions are consistent. A 10-year-old was suspended for rolling his eyes. A 9-year-old was handcuffed for having a panic attack. And a 5th grader, Jamari Gaines, draws jail cells in his lunchbox instead of eating. This is not education. This is pre-incarceration. He signed it plainly. Mr. Calvin Brooks, 5th grade teacher, Maplewood Elementary. He sent it to the Eldridge Hollow Gazette, the only paper still running full issues in town. Then he waited. 2 days passed. No reply. Not even an acknowledgement. On the third morning, he walked into his classroom and found a manila envelope on his desk. No name, no return address. Inside was a printed copy of the letter he had sent, and a note written in clean serif font. Stay in your lane, Mr. Brooks. This is your first and final warning. No signature, no sender, just the weight of the message, thick and unmistakable. Calvin looked around the empty room, suddenly hyper-aware of the walls, the windows, the quiet. He opened the door slowly and scanned the hallway. No one. He took a step back and closed the door. And for the first time in his career, Calvin didn't feel like a teacher. He felt like a target. And somewhere down the hallway, someone else had just received a copy of that same warning. And it wasn't Calvin. The manila envelope stayed on Calvin's desk all day like a stain no one else could see. He taught the lessons, graded the work, even cracked a joke or two. But the words never left him. Stay in your lane. He replayed them like a threat and a dare. After school, while most staff rushed out before the buses even cleared the lot, Calvin lingered. He stayed until the custodian came through, mop bucket squeaking, keys jangling on a long ring, dustpan clinking behind. Mr. Leroy Sims had worked at Maplewood for nearly 19 years. Quiet, reliable, rarely in anyone's business, but never truly out of it either. He'd seen more than the administration, more than the teachers, more than the parents. As Calvin gathered his things, he caught Leroy's eye. You work late, Calvin said. Leroy paused, adjusted his faded ball cap. So do you. Calvin hesitated, then stepped closer. You ever seen a kid get written up for rolling their eyes? Leroy didn't answer at first, just swept slowly near the back cabinet. Then he said, without looking up, saw a girl get ISS last spring for chewing gum too loud. She was black, white kids been chewing like cows all year. Never heard a word. Calvin leaned against the bookshelf. I think they're targeting them. Leroy stopped sweeping. He finally looked up. You're not wrong, he said. Just careful. Calvin stared. Leroy tapped the mop handle against the floor. You loud. That's good till it ain't. Loud gets heard, but loud also gets hit first. Then, without another word, he returned to his cleaning. The next day, during lunch duty, Calvin stood near the back of the cafeteria, scanning the crowd when a voice approached from his left. You wrote that letter, didn't you? It was Miss Hannah Greer, a former substitute who used to rotate through 3rd and 4th grades. Young, white, and always looked like she'd stepped straight out of a college brochure, until she left abruptly halfway through the fall semester. Calvin nodded slowly. Why? She glanced around. Because I saw them do it. To a girl named Keisha, dragged her down the hallway by her backpack. All she did was walk to the nurse's office without a pass. Calvin's stomach turned. Who did it? Langford and the school officer. Said she resisted verbal instruction. But Keisha has an auditory processing delay. Documented. It's in her IEP. I saw it happen. Calvin stared. Why didn't you say anything? I did. She whispered. Wrote it in a report. Never heard back. 2 weeks later, my subbing schedule got cleared. No explanation. He exhaled. So you left. She nodded. Couldn't unsee it. Couldn't fight it alone either. Calvin felt something shift inside him. Not outrage. Not shock. Resolve. He walked straight to his desk during planning period and created a group email using his personal address. The subject line was simple. For teachers who still care. He didn't send it to everyone. Just 3. Hannah Greer, Mr. Leroy Sims, and Ms. Sherry Klein, the only white teacher who had spoken to Calvin more than once since the staff meeting. The next evening, they met in the back room of Eldridge Hollow Public Library, seated around a round wooden table with a single flickering overhead bulb. Calvin closed the door and lowered his voice. This is off record. This is personal. This is for survival. He pulled out Jamari's drawing, the jail cell one, and laid it flat. This isn't an isolated kid. This is a system, and we all know it. Hannah nodded first. I'll write everything I saw. Names, dates. Sherry added. I have screenshots. Group chats where teachers joke about problem kids. You won't like the language. Even Leroy, who hadn't sat yet, placed a USB drive on the table. Camera backups. From before they switched the system. You'd be surprised what they forget gets saved. The room was silent. Then Calvin spoke. We start now. Quietly. Carefully. We document. We prove. And we protect the kids no one else will. The group had a name by the end of the night. Teachers for Justice. Each week, they met. Each time they brought more. More evidence. More truth. More names. It wasn't a revolution yet, but it was a record. And records mattered. Back in the classroom, Jamari had changed too. Slowly. His eyes held a kind of weight that wasn't just fear anymore. It was expectation. As if he was watching to see if Calvin would keep showing up. And Calvin did. Every day. One morning, Jamari walked in and placed something quietly on Calvin's desk before taking his seat. It was a drawing rough, in pencil, but instantly clear. 2 stick figures. One tall with a red tie, one small with a backpack. A heart between them. Calvin picked it up slowly. Stared. No name, no words. Just a silent declaration. Jamari trusted him. For the first time, Calvin felt the pressure in his chest ease, not from relief, but from purpose. The boy who once closed his lunchbox like a vault, now handed over drawings like keys. But progress in places like Maplewood never goes unnoticed for long. That afternoon, just before dismissal, Calvin was called over the intercom. "Mr. Brooks, please report to the principal's office." He entered with his heart thudding, unsure what to expect this time. Principal Langford sat at her desk, arms crossed, face carved from cold marble. Next to her sat a woman Calvin didn't recognize, pale blazer, tight-lipped with a clipboard and a name tag that read District Liaison, Parental Relations. Langford gestured for him to sit. "There's been a complaint," she said flatly. Calvin didn't move. "From whom?" "We can't disclose that at this stage." "What kind of complaint?" The liaison leaned forward. "A parent has raised concerns about your relationship with a particular student." They used the word grooming. The word hit like a slap. "What?" Calvin's voice cracked in disbelief. Langford slid a printed email across the desk. "Anonymous submission. But it's enough to begin a formal review." Calvin stared at the paper. The language was vague, accusatory, thin, but in the eyes of administration and public perception, it didn't have to be solid, just damaging. He looked up, jaw locked. "You know this is retaliation." Langford didn't blink. "We're simply following protocol." "And who's protecting Jamari?" he asked, voice low. Langford tapped the desk. "That's not your responsibility anymore. Until this is resolved, you're suspended, with pay." The room shrank around him. The walls closed in. Everything froze. And while Calvin sat in silence, suspended for care, Jamari sat alone in class, watching the door his only protector no longer walked through. The word lingered long after Calvin had left the principal's office. Grooming. It was spoken only once, but its shadow reached far beyond the sterile desk and the forced professionalism of Principal Langford's voice. The accusation didn't need proof. It didn't need history. It just needed to exist, and once it did, it took shape in the minds of anyone ready to believe the worst. By the time Calvin walked out the front doors of Maplewood Elementary, he already felt it. Eyes behind blinds, phone cameras raised behind parked cars, and worst of all, silence. The kind that dared him to pretend nothing had changed. He wasn't escorted out. There was no scene. But somehow that made it worse. In the days that followed, the school board released nothing official. No emails, no statements. But the whispers moved faster than fact ever could. Local Facebook groups exploded with speculation. "He was always too close to that boy. That new teacher, I never liked his attitude. Why does he care so much if he's not related? Watch your kids." Just saying. The most damaging comments didn't accuse. They implied. The narrative twisted quickly from concern to danger, and Calvin became what the town feared most. A man who didn't fit in. A man who stood out. In a town like Eldridge Hollow, you didn't need guilt. You just needed gossip. Meanwhile, inside room 12, Calvin's absence became a void too loud to ignore. Jamari didn't ask questions when the new substitute arrived. A gray-haired woman with a permanent frown and a stack of pre-printed worksheets. He didn't speak. He didn't look up. He just returned to his shell. By the second day, he stopped coming to school altogether. No official truancy was filed. No home visit made. It was as if the system was glad he'd disappeared. One less problem to track. But Calvin noticed. He noticed because he was parked across the street from Jamari's building every morning at 8. He didn't get out. Didn't approach. He just sat in his car and watched, not like a predator, but like a lifeguard banned from the pool. On the third morning he saw him. Jamari sat alone on the front steps of Building 6, clutching a weather-beaten book. The cover was torn, The pages curled from past rain. His feet dangled just above the ground, untied shoes barely clinging to his socks. He read slowly, lips moving without sound. Not for joy, for escape. A police cruiser rolled by. Jamari looked up instantly, not in curiosity but in habit. His body tensed. When the car passed, he returned to the book like someone ducking back into a cave. Calvin gripped the steering wheel, jaw clenched. He couldn't go to him. Not now, not with the rumors, not when everything about his presence had been twisted into threat. So he stayed, and watched, and broke. 2 days later he received a letter, not an email, from the district office. It was printed on plain white paper with an official header and a line at the bottom for signature. Administrative leave extension. Investigation pending. No contact with current or former students permitted during inquiry. The word pending did all the damage. It meant no end. No updates. No closure. He signed it with a pen that shook in his hand. That night, as he sat in his living room, phone screen glowing with comments from people who didn't know him but felt entitled to destroy him, he heard a knock at his door. Not a rap, a pound. He opened it slowly and froze. Kanisha Gaines stood on his porch, fury in her eyes, Jamari behind her holding tightly to the hem of her jacket. "You stay the hell away from my son," she snapped. Calvin held up his hands, confused. "Kanisha, I haven't." She threw a folded paper at his chest. It bounced off and landed on the floor. He picked it up. A screenshot. A Facebook comment thread. Someone had posted a blurry photo of him in his car outside her apartment. Still watching him even when he's off the clock? Somebody needs to call CPS. Kanisha better open her eyes before it's too late. Calvin's stomach dropped. "I'm just watching over him," he said softly. "From a distance, I'm not." "I know what you're doing," Kanisha said, her voice breaking. "But they don't, and they'll use you to get to us." Jamari looked up at him, silent again. Calvin stepped forward slightly. "I didn't mean to scare anyone." Kanisha blinked fast. "I'm not scared. I'm furious. They're painting you into a monster so they can wash their hands of my son, and you're letting them do it. I'm fighting it," he said. "Not hard enough," she spat. "You sitting in this house signing papers, hoping it'll all clear up." Meanwhile, Jamari's back to being invisible. Calvin opened his mouth but no defense came. She was right. Kanisha took a deep breath, her voice quieter now. "I don't need you to protect him. I need you to stand up for him. Not from your car, not from your laptop, from the place where they're trying to erase you." Then she turned. Jamari lingered for a second longer. Then, in a voice almost too low to hear, he said, "You promised." The door closed, and Calvin stood alone in the echo. The next morning, Maplewood Elementary's front office went quiet when the door burst open. Kanisha Gaines, eyes blazing, marched through the lobby with Jamari in tow, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his hand clutching his mother's. Behind the desk, the receptionist stammered, "Ma'am, you can't?" "I can," Kanisha snapped. "And I will." The main hallway froze as she stormed toward the principal's office, a woman on fire. She pushed open the door without knocking. Principal Langford looked up from her desk, surprised but unmoved. "Miss Gaines, you got 2 minutes to explain to me why my son's teacher got suspended for caring." Langford straightened her back. "There was a complaint. From who?" "I'm not authorized to disclose that information." Kanisha leaned in. "Then let me disclose something. My son was invisible until that man showed up. He didn't speak. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. That teacher brought him back. And y'all punished him for it." Langford stood now. "Ms. Gaines, if you're upset, we can schedule a formal meeting with—" "No," Kanisha said. "You're gonna hear me now." Jamari, still silent, stepped forward. He pulled something from his backpack. A picture. The one he'd drawn of himself and Calvin. He placed it on Langford's desk. Langford glanced down, lips tightening. Kanisha stared. "You see that heart? You know what that means? It means he trusted him. You broke that, and I'm not letting you break it again." Langford didn't respond. Kanisha picked up the drawing and held it to her chest. Then she said it, clearly, slowly. "I want Mr. Brooks reinstated. Now." And as the office filled with stunned silence, someone in the hallway recorded the entire exchange, and by nightfall the video would go viral. The video went viral before the school board could decide what to do. Grainy footage, filmed from a cracked phone camera just outside Principal Langford's office, showed Kanisha Gaines, standing firm, voice unshaking, as she demanded justice for her son and the teacher who cared enough to see him. That teacher brought him back. and y'all punished him for it. Within hours, the clip was shared across local parenting groups, tagged with phrases like, "Let him teach," and "Justice for Jamari." Some comments were skeptical. "We don't know the full story," but others struck deeper. This is what happens when black mothers speak up. A boy draws a heart, and they call it grooming? That teacher's the only one who actually gave a damn. By the time the Eldridge Hollow School Board met for their monthly hearing 3 nights later, the room was packed. Teachers, parents, custodians, and even 2 local reporters filled the seats, their whispers coating the walls with expectation. Calvin sat in the back row, deliberately low profile, but the tension around him pulsed. Kenesha sat near the front, back straight, shoulders squared. The board president, Dr. Marianne Fletcher, opened the session with carefully chosen words. "We are aware of the recent social media attention surrounding staff conduct at Maplewood Elementary. Due to the ongoing nature of the internal review, we will not be addressing specific personnel matters at this time." The room stirred. A few groans, some crossed arms. Kenesha stood. "I got something to address." Dr. Fletcher raised a hand. "Ms. Gaines." "No," Kenesha interrupted. "Y'all been doing the talking. Now it's my turn." The board hesitated, but the cameras in the room were already rolling. Kenesha reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of papers, texts, call logs, emails. She walked to the center of the room and laid them flat on the board's table. "These are screenshots of every communication I've had with Mr. Calvin Brooks," she said. "Every check-in, every homework update, every question he asked about helping my son. And not one, was inappropriate." Dr. Fletcher cleared her throat. "We appreciate the context, Miss Gaines. But," Kenesha pressed on, "I want every parent in this room to hear me. I've had teachers ignore my child for years. But the one who listens, the one who sees him, gets treated like a predator." A murmur ran through the crowd. A few parents nodded. Some looked down, uncomfortable. Kenesha held up her phone. "You want proof he never crossed a line? Here's his last message to me. Thank you for trusting me. I won't let Jamari down. That's not grooming. That's protection." A silence settled. Someone in the back clapped. Then another. Dr. Fletcher shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Gaines, we understand your frustration. However, there are protocols that must be followed." "Protocols?" Kenesha scoffed. "Like calling CPS when a child has a bruise from falling at home. Like suspending him for being defiant when he was asking a question. Your protocols are just racism in paperwork."
That one hit
hard. Even some of the board members blinked. Kenesha lowered her voice. "I'm not going anywhere. And neither is Mr. Brooks." By the time the meeting ended, no decisions had been formally announced, no apologies issued. But the next morning, Calvin received a short email. Subject, reinstatement. "Mr. Brooks, you are reinstated to your position, effective immediately. Please note your status will remain under administrative probation pending final review."
No welcome back.
No clarification, just a green light with caution tape around it. He returned to room 12 the next day. The students watched him carefully. Some smiled. Others seemed unsure. Calvin moved with quiet focus, determined not to show how much had shifted under the surface. But then he saw it. Jamari's desk empty. The chair still pushed in, the pencil box still neatly stored inside, but no backpack, no drawing. He asked the substitute. She frowned. "Oh, they moved him." "Moved him where?" She shrugged. "Some new evaluation said he was developmentally behind. Transferred him to an intervention class." Calvin's blood ran cold. He walked straight to the records office and requested access to Jamari's updated file. The label was there, freshly printed. Academic evaluation outcome. Developmentally delayed. The justification? A series of assessments conducted while Calvin was suspended. Tests Jamari likely didn't understand. Delivered by a staff psychologist who'd never spent a full hour with him. He flipped the pages. Vocabulary test results. Writing prompts. Notes stating minimal verbal engagement. Of course he didn't engage. His teacher was gone. Of course he didn't perform. No one explained why. Calvin clenched the folder and marched straight to Principal Langford's office. She met him at the door. "Mr. Brooks, I suggest you calm down. You evaluated a silent child during an active investigation without notifying his primary teacher or his mother." Langford folded her arms. "We followed district procedure."
You followed a script, he snapped. You wrote the end of his story before he could finish the sentence.
Langford stepped closer, voice icy. "You're on probation, Mr. Brooks. I suggest you remember that." He didn't reply. He walked out. That afternoon, after dismissal, he drove straight to Jamari's apartment complex. The sun had dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. He climbed the steps to Unit 6B and knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Louder. Still nothing. Then he saw it taped to the door with gray duct tape. A white sheet of paper. Child Protective Service. Notice of removal. Effective immediately. Calvin's hand went limp. He backed away slowly, his mind spinning. No sound. No warning. No calls. Kanisha hadn't said anything. Why? Why wouldn't she tell him? Unless. He rushed back to his car and pulled out his phone. Called her. Straight to voicemail. Again. Voicemail. A third time. Same. He sat in his car. Breath shallow. Engine off. Phone screen glowing in the fading light. And then it hit him. They hadn't just removed Jamari. They'd silenced Kanisha too. And somewhere across town, Jamari sat in a stranger's house, staring at another blank wall, wondering if anyone still knew where he was. The paper on the door flapped softly in the wind, but the impact of the words hit Calvin like concrete. Child Protective Services. Notice of removal. Immediate emergency custody. Granted, minor removed from premises due to unsafe living conditions. He stood there for several minutes, reading it again and again, as if it might change, as if he'd misunderstood. But the words didn't blur. They sharpened. Behind the locked door was a home. Struggling, yes, but held together by a mother's sweat and a son's silence. And now that door stood like a tomb, sealed under state orders. Calvin's hands shook as he dialed Kanisha's number again. Still voicemail. He left a message, this time slow and deliberate. Kanisha, I'm here. I saw the notice. Please just call me. Tell me where Jamari is. Please. He sat in his car until the sun dipped below the buildings, painting the projects in long, tragic shadows. No call came. The next morning, Calvin walked into the district office and demanded to speak to Child Protective Services. The receptionist blinked at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. You're not listed as emergency contact. I'm his teacher. She gave a tight-lipped smile. That doesn't make you family. I'm the only consistent adult in his life right now. Then he's more at risk than we thought, she said with a tone so casual it felt weaponized. He leaned forward. Where is he? I can't share that information. Calvin stared. He was taken because he's poor. The receptionist's smile never faltered. He was taken because he was in danger. No, Calvin said. He was inconvenient. She turned to her screen. If you don't leave, I'll have to call security. That's when it truly hit him. They didn't just remove Jamari from his home. They'd erased the only people who would fight for him. He left the building hollow, driving without destination, until he found himself parked in front of the library, the same one where Teachers for Justice had first met. Inside, the lights buzzed. The air smelled of dust and age. He opened his laptop and began searching everything he could. Emergency removals. CPS in Mississippi. Removal due to poverty. Termination of parental rights for low-income families. Every click led to something worse. He learned that the law didn't require visible abuse, just potential for harm. That dirty clothes or food scarcity could be framed as environmental risk. That if a judge ruled in favor of CPS, no appeal could stop immediate removal. It didn't take drug use. It didn't take bruises. Sometimes, it just took being poor. He sat at that library table for hours, until a librarian tapped his shoulder to remind him they were closing. When he returned home, he found it. A plain white envelope in his mailbox. No stamp. No name. Inside, a single sheet of paper. In uneven handwriting. Barely legible. Written in pencil. Help. Below it scrawled in the corner C, and what looked like a tear stain. It wasn't signed, but Calvin didn't need a signature. It was Jamari. Somehow, somewhere, the boy had found a way to reach him. A whisper across a wall, across a system designed to keep them apart. Calvin stared at the paper for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Aisha Monroe, a civil rights attorney he once met at a diversity conference in Atlanta. A woman who had taken on police unions, school boards, and systemic injustice in her sleep. Aisha, he said when she answered. I need your help. She didn't hesitate. What happened? He told her everything. By the end of the call, her voice was steel. This isn't rare, she said. They do this all the time. How? Because the system treats poverty like neglect. If you're poor and black, you're assumed to be dangerous. If you're poor and white, you're assumed to be unlucky. Calvin rubbed his eyes. Can we get him back? Maybe, if the mother's willing to fight. And if we can prove the removal wasn't lawful. She didn't even get a hearing, he said. That's common too, Aisha replied. Public defenders get overloaded. Miss a date. Judge signs off in 5 minutes. Calvin's voice lowered. He's 10. Aisha paused. And he's already in the system. If we don't move fast, he won't get out. He nodded, even though she couldn't see. Send me everything, she said. Paperwork, letters, that note. I'll drive it to you. No, she replied. You're staying close. I'll come to you. That night, Calvin didn't sleep. He sat on his couch, holding Jamari's note in his hands, like a prayer someone had folded up and slipped under the door of a burning house. The next morning, Aisha arrived in Eldridge Hollow. Her presence alone felt like a rupture. A black woman in a tailored suit with documents in one hand and defiance in her eyes. They met at a coffee shop just outside city limits. Neutral ground. She spread the documents across the table. CPS records, legal statutes, removal protocols. This wasn't just unlawful, she said. It was strategic. What do you mean? They waited until you were suspended. They used the window to label Jamari developmentally delayed. Then they used that label to justify concerns. Then they removed him during an unscheduled inspection, which they're legally allowed to do under emergency conditions. Calvin stared. What emergency? Single black mother. No hot water. Late to school. Teacher recently accused of misconduct. It's the perfect storm. But there's no proof of abuse. They don't need proof, Aisha said. They need probability. And in this country, the probability of harm to a black boy is assumed. Calvin looked at her, voice low. What do? We sue. Calvin blinked. We sue the school district for racial targeting. We sue CPS for unlawful removal. We petition the court to return custody. And we shine a light so bright they can't hide behind policy anymore. And if they fight, they will. Calvin took a deep breath. Then we fight harder. But just as they prepare the legal motion, Aisha gets an urgent call. Jamari's foster parents have filed to adopt him, permanently. Aisha stood in Calvin's apartment, her blazer off, sleeves rolled, as she scrolled through files on her laptop with unshakable focus. The table between them was buried in stacks of documents, yellow legal pads, CPS guidelines, and redacted school memos. Calvin had quietly collected over the past month. The silence in the room was no longer anxious. It was surgical, every breath deliberate, every glance loaded with purpose. They're fast-tracking the adoption, Aisha said, her voice flat but laced with urgency. His foster family filed with support from the social worker assigned to his case, the same one who filed the original removal report. Calvin blinked. How is that even possible? Because you can terminate parental rights under the umbrella of permanent placement. If they prove the birth parent is unfit, or that the child has adapted to the new home, a judge can approve an adoption before the biological parent ever sets foot in court. He rubbed his forehead. Kanisha doesn't even know yet. She will, Aisha said. But we have to act faster than the system, because it's already moving. That night, Calvin sat on the floor beside his couch, pouring through files while Aisha highlighted legal routes and case precedent. Hours passed like minutes. They built the case piece by piece. Step 1. Pattern recognition. Calvin pulled suspension records from the past 3 years, public documents he'd quietly downloaded from the district portal before they updated the system. The numbers told the story without needing commentary. Black students made up 17% of the population, but 64% of disciplinary referrals. White students with identical infractions received counseling. Black students got suspension. Behavioral reports used terms like disrespectful, defiant, and emotionally unstable, almost exclusively for black boys. This isn't just bias, Aisha muttered. This is data-driven discrimination. Step 2. Testimony. Calvin contacted the 3 other teachers from Teachers for Justice. Each one agreed to submit a written affidavit. Sherry Klein's statement detailed a group chat where staff joked about sending problem kids back to the jungle. Leroy Sims, the custodian, submitted a signed statement, confirming he'd overheard Principal Langford call Jamari a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. Hannah Greer attached notes from her time subbing, including a handwritten referral slip citing a black student for walking too loud. Step 3. Kanisha's voice. They found her 2 days later staying at her cousin's apartment, on the edge of town, the only person who hadn't shut their door after the CPS raid. Kamisha looked thinner, brittle around the eyes, but she stood tall when Aisha explained the plan.
They're trying to erase you, Aisha said. We can fight. But it starts with you.
Kamisha hesitated, then nodded. If they think they're gonna adopt my baby without a war, they got the wrong mother. Within days, Kamisha stood outside the Eldridge County Courthouse with a microphone in her hand, and a crowd behind her. She didn't use talking points. She didn't quote laws. She told the truth. My son was taken because I couldn't afford a better zip code. Because my hot water broke. Because I had to choose between a bus ride to work and buying peanut butter. They called it neglect. But it's not. It's poverty. And they used it to steal my child. The clip of her speech hit social media within hours. Local journalists picked it up first, then regional outlets. By morning it was on national feeds. That same week, Calvin leaked internal school memos he had quietly saved during his suspension, notes from staff meetings, disciplinary templates, and an email from Langford marked confidential that read, "We may need to reevaluate our disciplinary strategy. Certain students are creating administrative strain." The wording was vague enough to avoid immediate consequence, but clear enough to reveal intent. He sent the documents to Delaney Cross, a journalist from Atlanta who had covered systemic education disparities for years. She published a story titled, "From Desk to Detention: How Mississippi Schools Are Fast-Tracking Black Boys into the System." It went viral.
Thousands of shares. Thousands of comments.
Former students wrote in. Teachers from other districts echoed the same patterns. Activists mobilized. A small protest swelled into a movement. And behind all of it was Jamari's drawing. The jail cell. The heart. The red tie. It became the unofficial symbol of the campaign. The lawsuit was filed 2 days later. Gaines v. Eldridge County School District and Child Protective Services. A civil suit alleging racial discrimination, wrongful removal, and institutional neglect. Within hours, Calvin received an email marked urgent from the State Education Board. "Mr. Brooks, due to your involvement in pending legal action and allegations of unauthorized disclosure of confidential school materials, the board will be reviewing your teaching license for potential revocation." He sat in silence, eyes locked on the screen. They weren't done yet. And now, with everything on the line, Calvin must testify under oath, knowing one wrong word could end his career or finally save Jamari's future. It started with a headline. Short, direct, impossible to ignore. Boy removed from mom after empty lunchbox discovered. Minutes it had been shared by local educators, then regional activists. By noon it was posted on the front page of a national news site. Underneath the story was a photograph, not of Jamari, but of his lunchbox. The dented, faded Avengers tin, the one he opened slowly, closed quietly, protected like a secret. By the next morning it was everywhere. TikTok exploded. Creators stitched the headline with reactions. Educators told stories of students punished for poverty. Mothers cried on camera. Teens read aloud from Jamari's court transcripts with disbelief in their voices. His drawing, the jail cell, the stick figure, the heart, became a symbol printed on hoodies, posters, and profile pictures. The hashtags trended. Justice for Jamari. Lunchbox raid. Let him speak. Schools not cells. Instagram flooded with clips from Calvin's classroom. Footage from students who had recorded his interactive lessons, his patient tone, his soft praise when Jamari read a sentence correctly. One video, captioned "He was the only teacher who ever saw us," had over 1.2 million likes within 48 hours. Former students wrote long posts. "I was one of the problem kids. Mr. Brooks never treated me like one. He taught me Shakespeare when I couldn't spell my name right. He made me believe I could be more." Parents who had once whispered behind his back now spoke out. "I never realized how biased the school was until I saw how fast they came for him." The Eldridge Hollow School District went into damage control. The superintendent resigned within the week, citing family obligations. Principal Langford was placed on extended administrative leave, though insiders confirmed she had been asked to step down quietly. The district issued a press release filled with carefully curated language, committed to equitable practices, re-evaluating disciplinary protocols, offering implicit bias training. But the damage was already done. Journalists camped outside the school board building. Protesters marched through Eldridge's downtown, holding signs that read, "An empty lunchbox shouldn't end a childhood. We don't need reform, we need reckoning." Protect black boys like you. Protect budgets. Meanwhile, Calvin Brooks became something else entirely. To some he was a hero, a man who stood when the system told him to sit, who chose a child over his career. To others he was a threat. The death threats came quietly at first. Anonymous emails, blocked numbers, twisted messages typed in all caps. Stay out of our schools. You want attention? You got it. Next is your house. Calvin kept the blinds closed and started locking both deadbolts, even during the day. His email inbox was a war zone, praise and poison side by side. But the public weight couldn't compare to the personal cost. He still hadn't seen Jamari. Every motion, every email, every protest, all of it felt like shouting into wind until he could look that boy in the eyes again and say, "You're not forgotten." Then, one Friday morning, Aisha burst into his apartment without knocking. She was out of breath, holding her phone in the air like a trophy. They caved. Calvin blinked. "What?" The judge saw the press, saw the letter Jamari sent you, saw Kanisha's speech. She granted an emergency hearing for custody review. Calvin stood slowly. "You mean?" Aisha grinned. "They're bringing him in. Tomorrow. Courtroom B. 10 The moment hit Calvin, like gravity. Every cell in his body slowed. Tomorrow. He was going to see Jamari, but not just see him. Testify for him. Saturday morning arrived gray and slow. The sky hung heavy over the courthouse like it knew what was at stake. People gathered early, not because they were required, but because the town had finally realized this story was bigger than gossip. It was a reflection of them. Inside courtroom B, the benches were packed. Reporters filled the last row. Teachers sat in the front. Kanisha stood at the side table, with Aisha, her hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then the side door opened. 2 social workers stepped inside, followed by a boy in jeans 2 sizes too big, a sweatshirt that wasn't his, and shoes without laces. Jamari. He didn't look around. His eyes scanned the floor like it held the only safe place in the room. Calvin rose to his feet. Jamari glanced up and their eyes met. For one breathless second, the courtroom ceased to exist. Jamari blinked. Then his lips twitched. Not a smile, not yet, but the beginning of one. Calvin exhaled for the first time in weeks. And now, as the judge calls Calvin to the stand, the next 10 minutes will decide not just a boy's future, but the cost of telling the truth. The courtroom was frozen in expectation. Judge Marla Everett, a composed black woman in her early 60s with a gaze that cut through pretense, adjusted her glasses as she looked over the docket. Her robe was pressed, her tone unreadable. "Next witness," she said, looking up. "Miss Jamari Gaines." A collective breath swept the room. Jamari stood slowly from the bench beside his CPS-appointed advocate. His hands trembled as he walked toward the witness stand. His sneakers squeaked. He didn't lift his head. When the bailiff asked if he would swear to tell the truth, Jamari gave the slightest nod, barely audible. The judge leaned forward. "It's okay, Jamari. Take your time." He climbed into the chair, legs dangling off the edge. His feet didn't reach the floor. His eyes scanned the ceiling, the corners, the bailiff, anywhere but the audience. Aisha stepped forward gently. "Jamari, I know this is scary, but you're doing so well. Can I ask you some questions?" Jamari nodded. "Do you know why you're here today?" He hesitated, then whispered, "To go home." The judge softened, just barely. Aisha continued, "Do you want to go home?" Jamari looked toward Kanisha, his mother standing just feet away, her arms crossed against her chest, her face trembling beneath a mask of strength. His answer was clear. "Yes." "Why?" There was a pause. Then in a voice barely above air, Jamari said, "Because my mama loves me." No one breathed. He glanced toward the social worker at the far end of the courtroom, then toward Calvin, then toward the judge. "I wasn't dirty 'cause she didn't care. I was dirty 'cause we didn't have a washer. I didn't have lunch 'cause she skipped hers. She don't hit me. She don't yell. She cry when she think I'm sleep." A tear rolled down Kanisha's cheek. "She didn't wipe." Jamari continued, voice trembling but louder now. "She worked all the time, even when she was sick. And I didn't talk at school, 'cause every time I did, they said I was too loud or rude. But Mr. Brooks, he listened. He brought me food and books, not 'cause he had to, 'cause he wanted to." Judge Everett leaned back, lips pressed tight. Aisha asked gently, "Did you ever feel unsafe with your mother?" Jamari shook his head. "No. I felt safe when she hugged me, I felt safe when she made grilled cheese on the hot plate, even when the stove broke. What about with the foster family? Jamari paused. They gave me clean clothes, but they never looked at me, like I was there but not really. Aisha nodded. Thank you, Jamari. He turned slowly and looked at the judge. Can I go home now? The judge didn't answer yet. She glanced at the state's attorney, a pale man in a navy suit, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. No questions, he muttered. The judge looked back at Jamari, her eyes tired but careful. You may step down, she said. Thank you, young man. As he returned to his seat, the courtroom remained absolutely silent. Even the shuffling of papers stopped. Calvin's name was called next. He stood slowly and walked to the front. His palms were sweating. But the moment he looked into Jamari's eyes, something steadied inside him. After being sworn in, Aisha approached the podium. Mr. Brooks, can you describe your role at Maplewood Elementary? I was a fifth-grade teacher, he said. Jamari was in my class. Were you aware of his home situation? I became aware, Calvin said, but only because Jamari allowed me to see it. His lunchbox was empty. He rarely spoke. His shoes were too small. The school didn't see any of it. What did they see? Calvin looked around the courtroom. They saw a threat. There were murmurs in the crowd. The judge raised a hand, and the room quieted. Please explain. Calvin exhaled. They labeled him defiant for crying during a timed test. They wrote him up for rolling his eyes. When he went silent, they labeled him emotionally disturbed. When he started trusting me, I was accused of grooming. The only thing I did wrong was care. Aisha nodded. And what happened when you tried to intervene? I was warned. Silenced. Suspended. My car was vandalized. My license is now under review. Do you believe Jamari was removed due to abuse or neglect? Calvin didn't hesitate. No. He was removed because the system decided poverty looked like danger. And what about Kenesha Gaines? She's one of the strongest, fiercest, most protective mothers I've ever met. She didn't fail Jamari. We did.
The courtroom murmured again.
Aisha held up a document. This is a disciplinary breakdown from Maplewood Elementary over the past 3 years. Can you confirm this is accurate? Calvin glanced at it. Yes. Can you read the first line? He read. Black students make up 17% of the student body, but account for 64% of all suspensions. Aisha turned to the judge. Your Honor, this isn't just about one boy or one mother. This is about a system that weaponizes poverty and silence. Jamari wasn't rescued. He was erased. And it took a viral video to even get us in this courtroom. The judge didn't speak right away. She looked at the state's attorney. Any cross? He shook his head. No, Your Honor. Then she turned to Kenesha. Ms. Gaines, please stand. Kenesha did. The judge's voice was firmer now. In reviewing the case, the testimony and the evidence presented, and after considering the child's own wishes, I am ruling in favor of immediate custody restoration. The room gasped. The judge wasn't done. The charges of neglect are dismissed. The CPS removal is hereby declared unjustified, and the Department of Children and Family Services is ordered to release Jamari Gaines into the custody of his mother by 5. Kenesha collapsed into tears. Jamari ran to her. The courtroom erupted into applause, tears and sobs. Calvin closed his eyes, overwhelmed, but Judge Everett wasn't finished. She tapped her gavel once. One more order. She turned her gaze toward the representatives from Eldridge Hollow School District, seated stiffly at the defense table. Given the patterns of racial targeting, failure to provide equitable resources, and retaliation against whistleblowers, I am referring this matter for federal inquiry under the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. The crowd went still again. I suggest your attorneys prepare, and as Kenesha and Jamari embrace, the school district's silence ends, and their panic begins. It didn't happen overnight. Redemption never does. The courtroom ruling shook Eldridge Hollow to its foundation. What followed wasn't a revolution, but a reckoning. Within weeks, the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights arrived in town with boxes of subpoenas and a quiet army of analysts. They walked the hallways of Maplewood Elementary, sat in on staff meetings, reviewed student records, disciplinary logs, and email chains. What they uncovered confirmed what Calvin and Aisha had already known. Disproportionate suspensions for black students. Biased referral language used almost exclusively against non-white families. Failure to accommodate IEPs. Unlawful communication with CPS without notifying guardians. By the end of the month, Principal Langford resigned officially. The state reassigned the assistant superintendent, and a third-party monitor was installed to oversee all disciplinary decisions in the district for the next 3 years. The town murmured. Some grumbled. But most watched in stunned silence, as the system once so immune to accountability was finally, if reluctantly, forced to answer. Calvin didn't return to room 12. Instead, the school board, under pressure from state officials and public demand, offered him a new position, Director of Equity and Inclusion for the entire Eldridge Hollow district. At first he hesitated. It felt like a compromise, a political gesture. But when he walked into his new office, smaller than a principal's but with a view of the playground, he saw it on the wall, Jamari's drawing, framed. The red tie. The stick figure heart, a child who refused to vanish. He accepted the role the same day. His first act was immediate, a comprehensive audit of all suspension records. By the second week, he'd reinstated 3 wrongfully expelled students and implemented a mandatory training program on racial bias and trauma-informed education for all faculty. Still, it was Jamari's return to school that truly marked the beginning of something new. The boy walked into the building that had once silenced him. Head up, backpack zipped, shirt ironed, his mother walked beside him. The same teachers who once ignored him now greeted him with nervous smiles. But Jamari didn't return to room 12. He was placed in a different homeroom, with a teacher trained in restorative practice and trauma support. And within 2 weeks, Jamari had joined the student council, after being nominated by 3 classmates, who said, "He never talks to be heard, he talks when it matters." At his first council meeting, Jamari raised his hand to suggest the school create a lunch with dignity program, where no student would ever be denied a meal, no matter what their account balance said. The board approved it unanimously. 2 weeks later, it launched. Elsewhere in town, Kenesha Gaines did something no one expected. She didn't leave. She stayed. And she built. Using the funds from a civil settlement and donations from the viral campaign, she founded Mothers on the Margin, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting single mothers facing eviction, CPS threats, and systemic poverty. The organization offered emergency stipends, legal aid referrals, and advocacy training. Within its first month, it served 47 women and reunited 4 mothers with children lost to hasty removals. Kenesha's voice, once ignored in parent-teacher conferences, now echoed through radio interviews, panel events, and local newsrooms. "I'm not a perfect mother," she said in one televised segment. But perfection was never the requirement. Being white was. Behind the scenes, Calvin and Aisha continued their work. The lawsuit had opened doors. 3 neighboring counties began their own internal investigations. A Southern education journal ran a cover story titled, "The Lunchbox That Changed a Town." The drawing, now dubbed "The Heart Behind Bars," was displayed at a national education conference. Calvin stood beside it, hands folded, knowing the work was far from over. Still, there were moments of peace, small ones. Like when Jamari stopped by Calvin's new office between classes and sat quietly on the corner chair. No agenda, no need, just presence. Or when Kenesha showed up to the district town hall with 3 mothers from her nonprofit, all of them there to challenge a new policy proposal. All of them armed with data and dignity. But redemption, even when earned, doesn't erase the scars. One gray afternoon, as rain tapped the windows of Calvin's office, Jamari stood near the bookshelf, flipping through a graphic novel Calvin kept for visiting students. He didn't speak for a long while. Then, as if asking the question burned longer than waiting for the answer, Jamari turned. "Why did it take this long?" Calvin froze. There was no easy reply, no polished line. Because the truth was layered. Because systems protect themselves. Because too many adults are afraid to see what's in front of them. Because silence is easier than standing. Because Jamari shouldn't have needed a hero. He should have just had a chance. But all Calvin could say, in that moment, was, "I don't know. But I promise it won't take that long ever again." And as Jamari nods quietly, a call comes in to Calvin's desk. A child from a neighboring district has just been suspended for threatening tone. Calvin recognizes the name. It's one of Jamari's old friends. The morning air felt crisp, sharp with the energy of a new school year. The halls of Maplewood Elementary buzzed with sneakers squeaking, lockers slamming, and the nervous chatter of fresh starts. But the walls were different now. Not painted, not remodeled, different in feeling. There were new posters in the halls. "See every child. Discipline is not destiny. Lunch is a right, not a privilege. And above the cafeteria entrance, in bold black letters on a golden banner, no child hungry ever. Calvin Brooks walked the halls with quiet purpose. His badge no longer read, Mr. Brooks, 5th grade teacher. Now it read Calvin Brooks, Director of Equity and Inclusion. His walk was slower, more observant, but his mind still sharp. He paused at doorways, smiled at teachers, nodded at janitors who had once slipped him, whispered warnings. But on this day, something familiar, something sharp and small, tugged at the edge of his awareness. It came in room 7. He was standing with the new homeroom teacher, reviewing the morning roster, when he noticed a boy, thin, quiet, sitting at the back, while others unpacked cartoon-decorated lunch bags and swapped juice boxes. This boy pulled a plastic lunchbox from his backpack, opened it gently, and closed it just as quietly. Empty. Calvin's breath caught. For a moment he wasn't in room 17. He was back in room 12. Watching a boy named Jamari Gaines, slowly, deliberately, close a battered lunchbox with no food inside. He felt it all again. The quiet shame, the hidden hunger, the silence that screamed. But this time, he didn't hesitate. He stepped closer, leaned in gently. "Hey there," he said to the boy. "I'm Mr. Brooks. What's your name?" The boy looked up, hesitant. "Michael." "Nice to meet you, Michael," Calvin said softly. "You hungry?" Michael's eyes widened, unsure if it was a trick question. He nodded, slowly. Calvin offered a small smile. "You don't have to be." He turned to the teacher. "Send him down to the cafeteria. They've got breakfast ready. No forms, no charge, no questions." The teacher nodded, already standing. And just like that, a new child was seen. That night, Calvin sat at his desk. The office was quiet, papers neatly stacked, but his wallet sat open beside his laptop. Inside it, tucked into the fold behind his ID, was a small crumpled note, yellowed with age, edges softened by time. "I'm hungry. Don't tell nobody. Mama said don't trust no white people." Jamari's handwriting, from a year ago. He unfolded it carefully, eyes tracing the same loops and smudges. He never took it out, unless he needed to remember why he started, and why he could never stop. That note had changed everything. Not just his job, not just Jamari's life, but a whole system. In the months after the trial, Maplewood implemented changes beyond anyone's expectations. The No Child Hungry policy removed all meal debt. Every student ate, regardless of form status. Teachers were trained to spot signs of food insecurity without shame. Anonymous meal pantries were set up in every hallway. Suspension policies were rewritten. Disciplinary referrals had to include a restorative action plan. Bias training became part of teacher certification. The school nurse now doubled as a community liaison, helping families with rent resources, transportation needs, and job connections. And every year, on the first Friday of September, the community hosted a back-to-school cookout in the park behind the school. It was free. It was public. It was packed. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees and laughter filled the air, Calvin stood at a folding table, helping serve plates of barbecue and baked beans. Children ran through sprinklers. Parents lounged in camp chairs. Music hummed low from a speaker nearby. And then, just past the basketball court, he saw him, Jamari, now 11, taller, fuller in the face, still quiet, but no longer small. He wore a blue shirt with a student council badge clipped to the front. His hair was styled neatly, his shoes new, his stride confident. Calvin raised a hand. Jamari smiled and jogged over. They stood side by side for a moment. No words, just presence. Calvin finally said, "You doing okay?" Jamari nodded. "Better than okay." Calvin chuckled. "Heard you helped write the new school meal pledge."
"I just helped," Jamari said.
Michael, the new kid, he was the one who told the council what happened. "It reminded me." Calvin paused. "Reminded you of what?" Jamari looked at him. "That it can happen again. If we're not watching." They sat on the edge of the table as the sun dipped low. Jamari picked at a piece of cornbread. "Mr. Brooks?" "Yeah?" Jamari's voice softened, eyes never leaving the food. "Why did it take this long?" Calvin didn't answer right away. He looked out at the field, kids running, families smiling, grills smoking, old songs playing low. "Because people like me were too scared," he said. "Too scared to lose jobs, too scared to speak up, too scared of being wrong." Jamari nodded slowly. "But you weren't." "I was," Calvin admitted. "But I did it anyway. And you helped me. Jamari looked at him, eyes deep and wide. I'm glad you opened my lunchbox. Calvin swallowed the lump in his throat. So am I. The night wore on. The music faded. Families packed up, waving goodbye. But Jamari stayed behind a little longer, helping fold chairs, carry trash bags, refill coolers. When he finally walked away, Calvin watched him go. No slouch in his shoulders, no silence swallowing him whole. Just a boy, full, proud, unbroken. What if no one had opened that lunchbox? No child should have to beg in silence just to be seen. No mother should lose her child because she's poor. And no teacher should be punished for doing what's right. If this broke your heart or opened your eyes, don't scroll past. Type yes if you believe every child deserves dignity. Subscribe if you believe silence is no longer an option.